All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final seminar in CARE's 2024 Fall Seminar Series. My name is Laura Klepper. I'm the Associate Director for Education for the Center for Acoustics Research and Education. And today we are very excited to be welcoming Dr. Rachel Buxton to our seminar series for a really exciting presentation on soundscapes and conservation and everything in between. So let me introduce Dr. Rachel Buxton to you all. Dr. Buxton is an assistant professor at the Institute of Environmental Science and Department of Biology at Carleton University. She leads a team that aims to generate knowledge to support and mobilize equitable conservation solutions. Her main research interests include urban bird conservation, soundscapes, ecological restoration, and the link between human health and biodiversity. She works with groups of practitioners, decision makers, Indigenous peoples, and stakeholders to ensure that her research is applicable for mobilizing effective conservation solutions. In drawing from her experiences as a research scientist, mom, lifelong learner, teacher, mentor, and community member, she is committed to making a difference for biodiversity conservation and environmental justice. So it is with great pleasure that I now introduce and turn it over to Dr. Rachel Buxton. Welcome, Dr. Buxton.
Well, thanks, Laura. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks a lot for the invite. It's really great that we get to continue to interact, and it's great that I get to keep sharing my research with you and your lab. I really appreciate it. So, as Laura mentioned, my name is Rachel Buxton. I'm a professor at Carleton University, which is the capital of Canada. In Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada. So, and as Laura mentioned, I'm in the Institute of Environmental and Interdisciplinary Sciences. So a lot of my research and what I'll be presenting today is very interdisciplinary. And my background is in conservation biology. I'm really a conservation scientist by training. So a lot of what I try and do in my lab and with my research is to move soundscape research from collecting information to mobilizing action for biodiversity conservation. So let's get started with some sound. Hopefully you can hear this. So sounds are all around us. Natural sounds like this dawn chorus on an Ontario lake in the summer, they're beautiful. They make us feel relaxed. Hopefully they're making you feel a little bit more relaxed on this snowy northeastern winter day at the end of the semester. But the sounds of nature have long generated powerful reactions in humans. From inspiring music and poetry, like Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, to providing the stark symbolism that ignited the entire environmental movement. So I'm thinking here of Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring. So sounds confer in people a sense of place. They connect us with nature. And as we'll learn, hopefully, throughout this presentation, they are essential for both wildlife and people. So before we get started, what is a soundscape? I know I'm probably preaching to the choir, but let's just make sure we're all on the same page. A soundscape is all of the sounds that we perceive in an environment. This includes sounds from biological sources, like bird vocalizations, sounds from geophysical sources like wind and rain, and human-made sounds. So this includes noise from road and air traffic. Now, why are sounds and soundscapes particularly important? Well, so ears of vertebrates in particular are extremely sensitive to sound. If we think back to physics, sounds are minuscule fluctuations in pressure. Now, the threshold of pain from sound in humans is the pressure change equivalent of 1.6 meter change in altitude. Now, the threshold of hearing for humans is 1/1,000,000th this amplitude. And so this is why we measure sound in decibels on a logarithmic scale. but it really begs the question, why are our ears so sensitive to sound? And it's not for hearing speech. It's not for hearing me talk. I just love this video. So the answer is that soundscapes provide crucial information for wildlife and humans. Many species rely on sound to communicate, but importantly, sound perception enables many species, including humans, to surveil their surroundings. So for many animals, like the vole in this video, hearing sounds can mean the difference between life and death. Now, for humans, soundscapes can provide indicators of danger and safety. And this has many downstream health consequences. So if we think of environments that are, or soundscapes that are full of different types of natural sounds versus soundscapes that are relatively empty, these are going to have different impacts on our autonomic nervous system. So let me just walk you through this really quickly. So in a soundscape that's full of lots of different types of natural sounds, there's sounds of water, lots of different species of animals vocalizing, the wind rustling the leaves in the trees, that's a pretty good indicator of an environment where all of our needs are being met. So in these sorts of environments, this will stimulate our parasympathetic nervous system, which leads to this sort of rest and digest mode. It facilitates any sort of recovery from stressful situations and psychological restoration. In the opposite environment, so an environment with not very many different types of natural sounds or missing natural sounds altogether, this is a pretty good indicator that all of our needs can't be met, or even worse, maybe a dangerous environment. If everything's gone quiet, that's not a very good sign. And so in these sorts of soundscapes with not very many different types of natural sounds, this is a pretty good indicator that some sort of action is needed. And what happens in this environment is we start surveilling our surroundings, and this can initiate our sympathetic nervous system or a fight or flight response. Stimulated in this fight or flight response chronically, so if we're constantly in this soundscape that's rather empty, this is going to have downstream health effects because this can lead to chronic levels of stress. So in a study by myself and some colleagues, we did a meta-analysis, a study of all the research that looks at the health benefits of natural soundscapes. And we put all of this research together, and we found that listening to natural sounds has positive affective outcomes and positive health benefits, and can actually decrease stress and annoyance. And we saw really an amazing array of literature of all the benefits of listening to natural sounds. This included decreasing pain during painful surgeries, improving cognitive performance. I'm sure we can all attest to how restorative it is on our cognitive functioning to listen to natural sounds, improving our mood, decreasing heart rate and stress. So there's really is an incredible array of benefits of natural soundscapes. And this really underscores the importance of natural sounds. So natural sounds are important, but soundscapes are also under threat. So in this study in 2017, we looked at threats to natural soundscapes, so threats within protected areas to soundscapes caused by noise pollution. We looked at recordings from over 490 parks around and protected areas around the United States. We did some fancy modeling, and what we found is that noise pollution really is pervasive in protected areas in the continental United States. About 2/3 of protected areas, so the protected areas that you see in yellow and sort of light green in this map, experience noise pollution levels that limits the listening area of vertebrates by 50%. So really high levels of noise pollution are being experienced in many of these important areas for conservation across the United States. Whoa. So I don't know if you could hear that noise, but that was honking of of cars. And this is just to underscore that noise pollution has really serious consequences on a soundscape. For one thing, it's really annoying, and that's a problem. That leads to a lot of the health implications of hearing noise. It's estimated that in the EU, noise costs 1 million healthy life years per annum. So that's a lot of health consequences. For biodiversity and wildlife, noise can have cascading effects on entire ecosystem functioning. So noise affects animals, including humans, through three main perceptual mechanisms. Noise can mask important sounds. So I mentioned that soundscapes are very important. They're very important for communication, but also for surveilling surroundings. So if noise is covering up those important sounds, it can interfere with important communication mechanisms for many different animals. Noise can also lead to a distraction. So animals, humans included, have a finite amount of attention that they can pay to different tasks. And if animals are too busy paying attention to noise, they have less time in their behavioral budget for really important life tasks like finding food and avoiding predators. And noise can also lead to misleading. And this is where noise is detected as a natural cue, like a predator or a threatening sort of cue. And it provokes an inappropriate and often maladaptive response in animals where they flee an area or they become chronically stressed. So these are the three different ways by which noise affects animals and wildlife. And noise is a major threat to soundscapes. But another major threat to soundscapes is steep declines in sound producing organisms. So I'm not sure, this is a really classic figure now to show, especially within ornithology. But there really are some alarming declines in bird populations, which are one of the major sound producers in soundscapes. We've lost about 3 billion birds since the 1970s. And I can only imagine what kind of effect that's had on natural soundscapes. Okay, so because of the importance of soundscapes in containing information about animal communication, and also the increased affordability of recorders, we now have the ability to monitor soundscapes at really enormous scales. So this is really exciting. We know that soundscapes are really important. We know that they signal lots of different things about the health of different ecosystems because they reflect underlying communication of different animals. And now we can monitor these soundscapes at huge scales. So here's just two examples. I'm sure there's many others. But the Australian Acoustic Observatory, they've collected recordings from about 400 sites around the country. They say it's about 2 petabytes worth of data every year. And all of these data are openly available. So anyone can tap into this data set. It's really neat. I used to work for the National Park Service's Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division. By the time I left in 2019, they had collected acoustic recordings from over 490 sites around the country. I'm sure this number is higher now. And again, this is publicly owned data. You know, it's collected by the National Park Service, so anyone can use these data. So we're living in a really exciting time where we can tap into these enormous data sets and answer questions about soundscapes at entire continental scales. Talk about how we analyze these data and listening and trying to pull out different sounds. But really, more likely, what we use these days data science techniques. So there are many different methods out there now, convolutional neural networks, so different acoustic indexes that take out mathematical properties of a soundscape and of amplitude and frequency of a soundscape. And then there's also recognizers. So these are machine learning methods that go through large-scale recordings and actually try and pick out calls of specific species. So I put up BirdNet here. This is sort of the most famous example, a machine learning recognizer that's been created by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So again, we're in a really exciting time where we can collect these huge scale recordings across entire continents. We can pull out biological information using a recognizer. We can use acoustic indexes. We can listen, and we can get at really interesting and fundamental questions about ecology, about the distribution of species, about how humans are impacting different areas and the health of different ecosystems. So it's really incredible, and it's an exciting time to be a soundscape ecologist. But as a conservation scientist, I really go back here, right? As these data continue to increase and pile up, bird populations continue to decline, right? There's some populations of birds that they lose 20% of their population every single year. So we're facing really, really alarming declines. And I don't know if any of you have read this paper, but it's something that I come back to again and again. This idea that we continue to monitor the environment as it continues to decline. So in this vein, a few years back, I explored the sort of existential crisis of a conservation scientist with some colleagues from across Canada. We did this as part of Canada's commitment to the Aichi biodiversity targets. I was working for the federal government at the time. Just a side note that we did not achieve any of our Aichi biodiversity targets, which expired in 2020. So again, not a very good sign for ecological health. But we explored this question, what, as scientists, what are the key pieces of information that we need to move from continuing to collect information to action, to actually acting and making the world a better place for biodiversity. And it was a really interesting exercise. And really what my colleagues and experts across the country concluded is that first and foremost, we need to co-produce research with decision makers to ensure that knowledge is being mobilized. So knowledge mobilization was a key theme that was identified by experts. The other key theme, especially in a Canadian context, but really this can be applied globally, is supporting Indigenous sovereignty and amplifying Indigenous ways of knowing. So we know that Indigenous people across the globe are incredible caretakers of biodiversity. There are very high levels of biodiversity on Indigenous lands across the board. And so this was identified as something that's really key to moving from collecting information to mobilizing this knowledge. So over the next part of my talk, I'd like to walk you through 3 examples from my research group where we're trying to take these principles to heart, and we're trying to move from continuing to collect soundscape information into mobilizing action for biodiversity conservation. I highly doubt that this is perfect, but I'm just going to give you some examples from how we're trying to move forward with these methods. So I'll walk you through an example where we're looking at the outcomes of noise reduction in a local park to inform transportation planning. Another example in Detroit, where we're looking at the outcomes of urban restoration to support community-led revitalization. And finally, some preliminary results. This is early days, but looking at Indigenous-led inventory and monitoring in Northern Ontario. All right, so let's get started with looking at road noise reduction. So, noise from vehicles is one of the key sources of noise pollution in protected areas. And there are a few different methods by which park managers can try and reduce noise in parks and protected areas. The first is sound barriers. You can probably imagine how this would have some pretty serious drawbacks, limiting connectivity throughout a park. There's porous asphalt. This is where roads are repaved with asphalt that actually absorbs sound from vehicles. Again, pretty serious drawbacks. It's very, very expensive to repave road with this specifically engineered asphalt. And another, perhaps the cheapest and least complicated, is reducing the amount of traffic or eliminating traffic altogether. And while this sounds easy and straightforward, I'm going to give you an example where it's actually not. And it's actually does have a trade-off where we're reducing accessibility to parks and protected areas, which is another really important part of biodiversity conservation, connecting people with nature and natural spaces. So I'm going to focus on this idea of reducing traffic. This is a master's student in my lab, Lily Gaston, who you see in this picture. She's studying the outcomes of the National Capital Commission, a managing body in Ottawa, their attempt at reducing and eliminating traffic from this very popular park just outside of Ottawa called Gatineau Park. It's a really large conservation park, and as you can see, the star here is Ottawa. That's the capital of Canada. And this is Gatineau Park, just northwest of the city. So it really sits at this urban wildland interface. It's got a really high level of biodiversity because it sits at the boundary of the Canadian Shield and the St. Lawrence Lowland. So there's like a very, very high concentration of species. And many of these species are at risk. So over 60 of the species that are in Gatineau Park are legally listed as at risk of extinction. It's also got a really high rate of visitation. Over 2.7 million people visit this park every year. So it's a really high conflict area between park users and biodiversity. Now, since 2020, in the pandemic, the National Capital Commission, who manages the park, have trialed weekday road closures of the main parkways. So as of now, the parkways are only open Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday after 1 p.m. And the roads are closed at night. There's also a park that they have permanently closed within the park. And this road was chosen for closure because of its proximity to wetlands. So there was a lot of roadkill that was occurring of turtles and other amphibians. And the NCC, or the National Capital Commission, they're really interested in the outcomes of traffic reduction for wildlife, because these road closures are a very hot button issue. So they approached our lab and they were really interested to see what happened, because this is the sort of fallout that they're getting from closing these roads. So there's been petitions that are going around to try and reopen the parkways, very vocal protests from many park users. But then on the other side, there's also people who feel very passionately about continuing to keep the road closed. So conflit d'usage means conflict of use. And this beer was made by a local brewery of mountain bikers and road bikers who want to continue to keep the roads closed. So there's very, very strong feelings about these road closures, really on either side of the debate. So the NCC is interested in knowing what are the biological outcomes of this road closure so they can better inform park users. So this is what Lily set out to do. She set out a series of acoustic recorders near roads that have been permanently closed. That's that red road that you see, the red stippled line. She set out ARUs near the parkways that are closed and only open on Wednesday, Saturday, Sunday. That's the black stippled line that you see. And she also put recorders out on roads that are always open, and that's those non-stippled black lines that you see. So we place these recorders 100 meters and 500 meters from each of these different types of roads. Here's what the setup looks like. She also put out camera traps. So I'm not going to go into what we found with mammals today. I'm going to focus predominantly on what we found in Soundscapes, so using these ARUs. We've recorded for 2023 and 2024, so we have quite a bit of data from both summers, from May through July, so the breeding season for birds in the area. Lily has gone through and manually extracted many different birds from these recordings, from a subset of these recordings, to look at the diversity of different birds that are singing within the soundscape. And we've also employed this BirdNet algorithm to look for specific indicator species of interest. So we're using sort of both of these methods to extract information from these soundscapes. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to walk you through what she's found extracting species diversity from these different recordings. So again, we're looking at different treatments of roads. So permanently closed roads, temporarily closed roads. So these are the ones that are only open on Wednesday, Saturday, and Sunday. And then permanently open roads. So they're always open to traffic. We looked at days of the week because of these temporarily closed roads. So days when the roads are open to vehicles versus closed, the distance to the road, so at 100 meters or 500 meters, and then different habitat features that may also be driving where birds are. So let's have a look at some results. What you see here is the different treatment areas. So permanently closed roads, mitigation, which is temporarily closed roads, and permanently open roads. So when she ran this model on Shannon diversity, the top model came out as an interaction term between treatment area and the distance to road. So Shannon diversity increased closer to roads when traffic was fully removed. So if you look in this red box here, this is the roads that are permanently closed to traffic. And you can see in these areas that there's a higher diversity of birds closer to the roads. So this is probably due to an increased abundance of edge and forest species. So she saw increases in both of these types of birds closer to the road once you remove traffic. So pretty neat results. Now looking at indicator species. So she also ran similar models with all of these different variables on species at risk. So this is the wood thrush. It's legally listed in Canada. Its threat status is threatened with extinction. And it's found throughout the park. And so she looked at the occupancy of these birds at all the different sites and compared that with these, again, with these different features. Okay, so again, for this bird, the top model included, for the occurrence of this species, included an interaction between the treatment area, which is the different types of roads, and the distance to roads. So if we have a look here, there's much higher occupancy of wood thrush on roads with no traffic than roads with lots of traffic. So here I have a box around closed roads where you can see much higher probability of occurrence and much lower probability of occurrence in areas where the roads are permanently open. And really, we're seeing the highest probability of occurrence in the closed treatment further from roads, and the lowest probability of occurrence in the open treatments closer to roads. So, roads are having a huge effect on the probability of occupancy of this particularly imperiled species. So, at the community level, our main takeaways are that distance to road and habitat feature, or sorry, distance to road and the treatment type, so the closure type of the road, is driving species diversity of birds. We're also seeing some interesting effects of traffic reduction on species-specific response, so on the probability of occupancy of particular species. So I've just shown you an example of wood thrush, which is a species at risk. We've also looked into several other forest indicator species, which seem to be following similar trends. So the highest probability of occupancy at these closed roads. Okay, so let's bring this back to this idea of information to action, right? That's the goal here, is to create this information, this evidence of the efficacy of these roads. Now, how do we mobilize that information into action? So because we've partnered with the National Capital Commission, they are the ones who funded this project, they have a vested interest. What they're trying to do now is mobilize this information to park users. So these are preliminary results, but they've already created a blog post about the results of Lily's field season. And so that's the first step in knowledge mobilization. The next step is at their visitor center. They're hoping to have some handouts for folks as they enter the park and some signage. The next step for them is to trial a shuttle system. And we're going to continue to collaborate because they have a shuttle that runs when the parkways are open. But what they want to do in following years is have the shuttle running all week long at all times. And so what we're gearing up to do is look at the outcomes of running shuttles more often throughout the parkway, to try and inform their transportation strategy, to look at whether or not these shuttles are having any sort of impact on soundscapes and bird diversity. So still early days, but this is the plan for mobilizing this information into conservation action. Okay, so the next example I'd like to walk you through is looking at the co-benefits of urban restoration. So this project is in Detroit, which as a Canadian, I knew nothing about until about 4 years ago when we got this funding. It's perhaps the most fascinating and wonderful and resilient place I've ever worked. In the 1950s, the human population of Detroit underwent a massive decline. The population in the city has shrunk by about 1.2 million people over the past 70 years, massive exodus. And we all know who left. It was largely wealthy white people. So remaining in the city center is largely poor African American folks. And you can see here there is a long history of racism and policy-driven racism in the city. You can see here these are red-lined neighborhoods, so people who were denied loans for their homes based on essentially the color of their skin. And so now what you're left with in the city center is a lot of spaces that look like this. So vacant land makes up a huge portion of the city. If you have a look at this map here, the dark green polygons represent areas where vacant land is 80% or higher. So just massive amounts of vacant land and a lot of like derelict buildings and crumbling infrastructure. And so the city of Detroit's response has largely been this, to go around to these vacant lands and take down existing trees and to mow them. That's really been their strategy. And as you can imagine, anyone who knows anything about pollinators and biodiversity, this is a real travesty for encouraging biodiversity within the city. And so what we did was team up with a whole bunch of different organizations, the Detroit Bird Alliance, which was formerly the Detroit Audubon Society, the city of Detroit, and a whole bunch of different universities. And we followed the course of this project called Detroit Bird City, which was an effort by Detroit Bird Alliance to restore about 4 or 5 different parks or derelict parks and vacant lots into intentional meadows. So the native ecosystem of Detroit is tall grass prairie. And so they planted a bunch of native plants and also created infrastructure. So these signs, benches, little free libraries made these into spaces that people were able to recreate in. And this was all community driven. So this was driven by what folks in the community were looking for. In certain instances, they actually wanted things like basketball hoops and other sorts of structures like that. So a lot of the structure of the final park was driven by local folks. So here is an example of what it looks like. Some of these parks look like that were rehabilitated. So, going from mown lots or derelict lots with, crumbling structures on them, garbage. They were cleaned up and planted with this native seed mix. And what my grad student, Chris Dennison, went out and did was put 100 audio moths around these different sites. So around these rehabilitated sites, he put out randomly distributed 10 audio moths in each neighborhood. And then we did the same thing for paired non-rehabilitated parks. So he put out 10 recorders in these neighborhoods as well. So we had paired, rehabilitated, and non-rehabilitated lots. He did something similar to Lily. So he counted all of the different species of interest, bird species of interest within the soundscape recordings, and then also used BirdNet, this recognition algorithm put out by Cornell. So he used this sort of two-pronged approach to extract information about birds from these recordings. Now, interestingly, so keep in mind, we've only been following these restoration projects for about 3 years now. So these are preliminary results. It likely will take much longer for bird communities to respond. But so far, we've seen no response from bird communities. There's really no difference in the diversity and richness of birds that are using restored parks over time versus unrestored parks. So you can see, big clouds of data within each of these bars. Not much going on. And what we think is happening is that birds really like vacant lots. They really like these messy spaces that are just left alone. So, Chris looked at sort of a landscape approach and the density of vacant and distribution of vacant lots around these recorders, and found that in areas with high densities of vacant lots, birds really like those areas. You can see here a few different indicator species where the probability of occupancy gets really high as the number of vacant lots increases. So, there might be no effect of restoration. It's certainly not hurting anything. But birds are really drawn to these vacant lots. And so, this is a really important piece of information for the city as they move forward with their action plan of how they're going to revitalize these vacant lots. We also looked at how birds, vacant lots, and different types of green spaces within the city, how that affected the health and well-being of residents in these neighborhoods. And again, these are very preliminary results. This was work done by an honors student in my lab who found that there does seem to be a negative relationship between the diversity of birds and the amount of self-reported depression of residents in these neighborhoods. So, potentially encouraging results for trying to keep bird diversity high in these cities, in these areas. Okay, so again, bringing it back to moving this from collecting information to mobilizing action for biodiversity conservation in the city. Again, we've been working with Detroit Bird Alliance and the City of Detroit because the City of Detroit is right now writing their strategy for how they're going to revitalize these vacant lots within the city. And written into their strategy is mowing, very aggressive mowing strategy. So, continuing to chat with the city and providing them with this information that these vacant lots are actually driving really high levels of bird diversity. And this is having a really positive benefit for the health and well-being of neighborhood residents. And so, coming up with alternatives to mowing. And the Detroit Bird Alliance, they've been restoring about 20 acres of grassland per year. So they're moving forward with this alternative strategy. Something else that we've done that's been really successful in getting community support is handing out newsletters every year. So we hand out these newsletters with what birds we've seen in people's neighborhood. And we've gotten, really positive responses. And a lot of folks will actually come out and use these parks more often. We've seen a surge in how many people are coming out and using the parks as we've engaged with folks and handed out these newsletters. Okay, so one more quick example before I wrap up here, because it's my favorite. So I was very, very privileged to get to go visit the Fort Severn First Nation this year. I got to go up to the very, very top of Ontario on the Hudson Bay and hang out on the First Nation and support the Indigenous Guardian program up there. Fort Severn is a fascinating place. It's a biodiversity hotspot. It's polar bears, you name it. They got it all up there. It's a really neat place, but it's also undergoing rapid change. So Fort Severn is a watershed. The First Nation is at the mouth of the river. So this is where the river feeds into the Hudson Bay. But the headwaters of the Fort Severn watershed, 80% of it is mining claims. So, and this is largely for precious minerals like lithium. So we're on the precipice here of massive amounts of change. And the Fort Severn First Nation, they don't have the tools to come to the policy table. They totally lack the resources to be able to come to the policy table and negotiate. So the idea here is that there is a guardian program set up by the community, and we went up just to provide tools. So we came with acoustic recorders and camera traps and just tried to figure out what they wanted to know more about. And the idea is to start inventorying and monitoring using 2 different knowledge systems in order to bring folks to the policy table armed with information about biodiversity in the region. So we went up in April, in late April, I believe, and we brought up a bunch of acoustic monitors. We met with the Indigenous Biodiversity Guardian. He really doesn't like that name because there's no Cree word for biodiversity. So we're working on a name. But as of now, he's the Biodiversity Guardian. And we had an info session in the youth center where we looked at different sites that were potentially really important culturally. And so he informed this, and then there were lots of other folks within the youth center who were chiming in with different areas that are important. We set out these acoustic recorders. So first at the youth center, we showed folks how to set them up, and then the guardian went out and set them out. So he was responsible for choosing the final areas where these got put out. So he ended up placing them in 3 different sites, and they were placed in late spring. So just as the ice was starting to melt, in order to capture not only the goose hunt, so geese make up about 20% of the diet in Fort Seven First Nation. They're a cultural keystone species. And then also to capture spring migration, so the migration of boreal birds into the region. And it was pretty remarkable. When we were up there, we also got the opportunity to listen to different stories about these sites and about the birds in the region. And so that really helped inform our analysis and helped inform what we ended up creating from these recordings. And then my honors student went through the recording. So we got to go back up in August and collect the recorders and chat with the community. I got to eat caribou for the first time, which is really cool. Anyway, it was like an amazing experience. And this is what she has created. So here we have, again, the same sort of analysis as Lily and Chris. So going through the recordings, listening, trying to pull out different species, and then also using BirdNet, that algorithm. So she used BirdNet to try and pick out goose detections because of the importance of geese. And what you see here in this graph is the detections of Canada geese throughout the recording period at all 3 sites. So you've got the start and end of the hunting season when there's this huge surge in Canada geese vocalizing in the recordings. You've got the yellow line there is gunshot, so the hunting is in full swing. And then around June, you've got like the sounds of crackling fire, so probably geese being eaten over the fire, which is pretty cool. And really what we have here is this interweaving of like storytelling and acoustic recording. So these different knowledge systems coming together to inform, what birds we're seeing at these culturally important sites and their cultural importance to local folks. So that was a lot of projects to throw at you all at once, but I hope you enjoyed that. And I'm always happy to answer more questions or things that weren't clear. If you just want to know more or chat about birds and acoustics, I've put my email and the link to my lab here. And I do want to give a huge shout out. All of this research is run by my grad students with my support, and we have a ton of partners as you saw throughout the talk. So it really takes a village, and I'm very grateful for the teamwork that I get to do. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was fantastic, as always, unexpected. I think what I love so much about your research is you have always been, and you were still very much at the forefront of acoustics research and how, we kind of bleed that into practice and how to make that kind of a one-stop doing all of those steps in a pipeline. And that's what I really admire about your research is how you're not just thinking about the acoustics, you're also thinking about the people at the end who are going to benefit from that. And I think actually wrote down, because you said a statement that really resonated with me at the beginning of your presentation about it's really important to co-produce research with the decision makers. And I think that's a really important statement for all of us to think about, both whether we're students, early career, or people more late in career, and that's really how you do impactful science. So I think everything you're doing is so creative. I think the work that you're doing, with the Indigenous-led inventory and monitoring, that's really so crucially needed, and it's just really great to see how you were sharing some of your workflow with that. With that, I am going to ask if anybody has any questions, if they can put it in the chat, or if they would like to ask it themselves, they can kind of raise their hand and I will call on them. I'm going to start off by asking a question. I'm going to hijack the questions for you, Rachel. So, with your project in um, Detroit, I know you were focusing just on birds, but soundscapes obviously are more than birds. So I'm curious, did you pair your work with any like acoustic indices? Do you have, now that BirdNet has so many new detectors available and more added, it seems like every day, do you plan on going back and doing any sort of insect detection or frog
Mm.
detection or anything like that to see get if you might see that rise in biodiversity before, if that's the first rise that you see before the birds begin to start to recover?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we focused on birds. I don't think there would be any frogs. There is, so because this is such a huge team effort, there's a botanist who's also part of the program. So she's looking at the how the native plants are taking to the area, which is really important. I think there might be an entomologist as well who's looking at pollinators. But I think as far as like insect sounds, that one might be interesting, but a bit trickier. We have tried, so Chris's second chapter is looking at acoustic indexes and the efficacy of BirdNet itself. Turns out BirdNet is terrible in urban environments. It really performs very poorly. It also performs very poorly in if you're looking at community level metrics. So if you're looking at species diversity, it will mistake a rose-breasted grosbeak for a robin all the time. So it performs very poorly. Acoustic indexes also perform really poorly in the city because you've got so much noise and sounds from people. So I think if I were going to go further with like soundscape work, I think it would be really interesting to maybe take an ecosystem services approach where we're looking at like, how does noise change as you change the landscape, as rehabilitate these green spaces? Is there any difference in noise and human sounds?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, we have a couple questions coming into the chat here. Okay, so the first one, and I know this is one of my students, so this is an undergraduate student asking this question. Hello, as someone who does research with birds, specifically bird window collisions happening here at the University of New Hampshire, I was curious on your thoughts on how these soundscapes are possibly affecting the amount of birds being affected by window collisions.
Cool. Yeah, I also have a student in my lab looking at bird window collisions. So great question.
Cool.
Yes, I don't know what the link between soundscapes and window collisions would be. That's a really interesting way of looking at it. One way we've tried to pair them in our lab, at least, is to look at like the sound of the collision as a way of monitoring bird window collisions. It's a little gruesome, but and then also looking at the community of birds around a window and their vulnerabilities. So looking at the community of birds and then which ones in particular are hitting windows. But yeah, I'm not sure what the link between those. Did you have something in mind? Like, do you have a hypothesis?
Well, how about if Morgan has a follow-up to that, we'll let Morgan put that in the chat. Give her some time to type that in. We'll move on to the next question. Sarah Dodgen, I'm sorry, Sarah, if I'm not pronouncing your last name correctly, says, "Thank you, Rachel. I loved your entire talk. What is the next step for the Severn Nation to advocate for their lands with the threat of mining on the horizon?"
Yeah, yeah. Oh gosh, it's so complicated and tricky and that could be a whole other talk. But the next step, there's been a few next steps. So the undergrad student who's working on the recordings is also trying to start up a youth program. So engaging with youth and capacity building to get more people putting out more recorders on their own terms. So often what happens, like really across the board, but is with the government, is the Canadian government will come in and they'll put out a bunch of recorders and then they'll collect the data and then they'll include the community, which really never ends up really happening. And so the idea here is to build capacity within the community, so with young folks, to actually get them putting out recorders and them processing the data. So I think that's going to kind of be the next step is like building capacity, getting young folks trained up to go put these out themselves. And then the next step would be actually training them to analyze the recordings themselves. So building capacity, I think, is the next step.
Great. I was muted. Sorry. Okay. The next question is from Emma Foley, saying, when these vacant, this is referring to the Detroit study, when these vacant lots are restored, does the community use them more? I was thinking if there are more people in these lots, that now may be a factor as to why there is no effect of bird diversity in restoration.
Oh, good question. Okay, so more disturbance, fewer birds. Yeah, or just not more birds. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, it could be that they were left alone and then, yeah, that's a really good point. I don't think there's like a huge surge in the number of people around, but certainly more than there was. There's also more disturbance, as you say. So there are small paths that are mown around and paths that are mown into the park. So that could be another cause of disturbance for sure. But, something that I mentioned sort of very quickly at the end is that they're certainly not harming. We're not seeing declines in species diversity or declines in species occupancy at those sites. Whereas if they were completely mown over and the trees were brought down, you likely would see large declines. So, even though we didn't see an increase in different bird species, we didn't see decreases, which I think is encouraging as an alternative to things like mowing. But good
Okay,
point. Yeah.
Morgan has a follow-up on her hypothesis, and then we're going to do one last question that's in the chat from Danielle, because we're at time, and I want to be respectful of your time, Rachel. So Morgan, with the bird collision, she said she does have a hypothesis. She was thinking that birds that are less affected by the urban noises might be observed to collide with windows more frequently. So if the birds in these urban, if I'm understanding Morgan's question, if birds in urban environments might have a higher collision risk than birds that aren't affected. Oh, Morgan, you've unmuted yourself. Do you want to clarify more?
Oh, no, wait. Wait, give me a second. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Yeah, yeah, really interesting thought. Yeah, sort of like an ecological trap where quiet areas, birds are hanging out more and colliding.
Morgan, we caught Morgan eating lunch. She was not
Yeah,
prepared.
sorry. I'm in Spalding, so there's like a lot of noise happening right now. That's why I've been typing it off screen. Um, so yeah, I was thinking that there's a lot because there's a lot more sound happening in urbanized areas, that there's gonna be more collisions happening, which kind of makes more sense, I guess.
Mm, yeah, fascinating. Well, I can't wait to see the results from your study.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan. Okay, the last question is from Danielle, my student you met, Rachel. Danielle wants to know, did you account for detection differences in your models for recorders that were near the roads at the different treatments in the park study? I'm curious if masking played a role in the number of species you detected, and nice to see you again.
Mm. Yeah, nice to see you. Well, nice to hear your question, Danielle. Yeah, that's a great question. So I believe that these models were fairly preliminary for Lily. But yes, what were they? what Chris did in his model, because noise is also a factor in, in urban areas. So what he did was put sound pressure level at lower frequencies, presumably from vehicles, um, in the occupancy models themselves and the detection probability. So, you have a decreased detection probability if noise levels are higher. So likely that didn't go into the models that I showed here, but that will feed into Lily's model. And not only does it affect our ability to locate the vocalization within the recordings, but also BirdNet's ability to locate these detect or locate the sounds of the birds. So yes, it will certainly be a factor in these occupancy models, likely as something that's affecting detection probability.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you so much for coming to visit us today virtually and to share your science with us and to, I think, just help inspire us on all the different ways that we can really apply acoustic monitoring for conservation in practice. So you're inspiring as always, and thank you for everything. And we can't wait to see what comes out next from your lab.